Today, we're talking about why the more you understand people, the harder it becomes to work with them. And here's what nobody tells you. There's a specific psychological burden that comes with understanding human behavior. The more you see, the less you can trust. The more you understand, the more isolated you become. And that isolation is quietly destroying your ability to execute with others. If you're someone who reads people well, if you can sense when someone's lying before they open their mouth, if you understand why people make the choices they do even when they don't understand themselves, if you've studied psychology or spent years observing human nature, then what I'm about to tell you will explain why you're struggling to work with almost everyone. Because understanding people isn't an advantage in execution, it's a liability. And the deeper your understanding, the heavier the weight becomes. Let me paint you a specific picture. You're working with someone, a colleague, a partner, a team member. On the surface, everything looks fine. They're reliable, they're competent, they seem engaged. But you see something else. You see the patterns. You notice when they're performing versus when they're authentic. You catch the moments when they're people-pleasing instead of being honest. You sense the anxiety underneath their confidence. You understand why they respond the way they do, even when their response doesn't make logical sense. And that understanding changes everything, because now you know they're not fully trustworthy. Not maliciously, but because they're human. And humans are inconsistent. Humans have defense mechanisms. Humans say one thing and feel another. Humans sabotage themselves without realizing it. So you can't fully trust them, and they can't fully trust you because they sense that you're seeing through them. There's a distance that forms, not because of anything either of you said, but because you understand too much. This is what psychologists call the burden of psychological literacy. The more you understand human behavior, the harder it becomes to accept human behavior at face value. And that makes connection nearly impossible. Here's how it works. When you understand people deeply, when you've studied attachment styles and defense mechanisms and trauma responses, you start to see every interaction through a lens of explanation. Someone's being defensive? You understand why. They're withdrawing? You know the nervous system pattern that's creating that. They're being competitive when you expected collaboration? You understand the insecurity driving it. And on the surface, this sounds helpful. Understanding creates empathy, right? Understanding should make you a better collaborator. But here's what actually happens. Every explanation becomes a distance. Every understanding becomes a separation. Because the moment you understand why someone's acting a certain way, you stop taking their actions as real. You treat them as symptoms of something deeper. And that treatment subtly communicates that you don't see them. You see what's broken in them. This is the paradox that psychologist Carl Rogers identified decades ago. He found that the more we intellectually understand people, the less we emotionally connect with them. Understanding people as patterns is different from encountering people as whole beings. And most people with deep psychological understanding are doing the first and missing the second. So you end up in this strange position. You understand people better than almost anyone. But that understanding isolates you, because you can't work with people the way normal people do. You can't take their words at face value. You can't trust their explanations. You can't believe their reassurances. Because you know too much about how unreliable human nature is. Let me give you a specific example. Someone on your team says they're committed to a project. A normal person hears that and believes them, but you hear commitment and you're already analyzing. Are they actually committed or are they people-pleasing? Are they saying this because they genuinely believe it or because they think it's what you want to hear? Do they understand what commitment actually requires, or are they optimistic about their capacity? And because you're asking all those questions, you can't relax into the collaboration. You're watching, analyzing, running psychological diagnostics on everything they say and do. And that watchfulness creates a barrier that feels impossible to cross. Psychologist Harriet Lerner studied this in relationships and found something important. She called it the curse of insight. When you have insight into someone's psychology, when you can see their patterns and defense mechanisms and childhood wounds, that insight creates a subtle superiority. Not intentional, but perceptible. And people can feel when they're being understood as a case study instead of encountered as a person. So they pull back. They become more guarded. They share less. And the distance widens. The very understanding that you thought would create closeness creates distance instead. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The deeper your understanding of human nature, the more pessimistic you tend to become about people's capacity for real change. You've studied enough psychology to know that people's patterns run deep. You've seen enough human behavior to understand that most people are driven by unconscious forces they don't even recognize. You know that real transformation is rare. Most people just cycle through the same patterns with different people. And that knowledge makes it hard to believe in people, hard to invest in them, hard to trust that they'll follow through. Because you understand that most people's intentions are genuine, but their capacity for consistent action is limited by neurobiology, conditioning, and the weight of their own trauma. So you approach collaborations differently than other people. You're more cautious, more skeptical, more prepared for disappointment. And while that protects you, it also prevents you from ever really working with someone. Because working with someone requires a level of trust that psychological understanding makes nearly impossible. Psychologist Daniel Goldman identified something he called emotional intelligence, and what he found is interesting. Emotional intelligence is supposed to make you better at relationships and collaboration, and it does, up to a point. But beyond a certain threshold, too much emotional intelligence creates disconnection, because you become so aware of dynamics and patterns that you can't just be present with someone. You're always analyzing, always diagnosing, always running psychological simulations of what's really happening beneath the surface. This is why some of the most psychologically literate people are also the most isolated in their work. They understand why people fail. They can see the patterns before anyone else. They anticipate problems before they develop, but they can't work with people because understanding has made them unable to trust. And work requires trust. Here's what this does to execution. You're working on something important. You need collaboration. You need someone to show up consistently. You need them to handle their piece without you managing every step. But because you understand people, because you see the patterns, because you anticipate the ways they might sabotage themselves or disappoint you, you can't fully delegate. You can't fully trust. You end up managing everything yourself, and then you're exhausted. And then you resent them for making you carry the weight. And they sense that resentment. And they pull back more. The cycle reinforces itself. Your understanding creates distance. The distance creates isolation. The isolation creates the very problems you were trying to prevent. Because when people feel unseen, when they feel like they're being analyzed instead of encountered, they become less reliable, less honest, less willing to take risks. They show up as smaller versions of themselves. So what do you actually do with this? How do you work with people when you understand them too well? The first thing is to recognize that understanding isn't engagement. You can understand someone completely and still not see them. Seeing someone requires suspending analysis. It requires encountering them as they present themselves, not as a collection of patterns and mechanisms. It requires choosing to believe their words even when you know words are unreliable. It requires trusting them even when you understand all the ways they might fail. This is what Rogers called unconditional positive regard. Not naive belief that people are good, but the choice to encounter them as whole people rather than as psychological case studies. The second thing is to accept that collaboration requires what you might call controlled ignorance. You can understand people's patterns without constantly pointing them out. You can see their defense mechanisms without needing to explain them. You can anticipate their failures without needing to prevent them. In other words, you can know things and choose not to act on that knowledge all the time. Because the goal of collaboration isn't to fix people. It's to work with them. And working with people sometimes means letting them discover things on their own. Letting them make mistakes, letting them be inconsistent, letting them be human. The third thing is to separate your understanding of why people are the way they are from your expectations of what they can do. You can understand that someone's defensive because of their history, but you can still hold the boundary that defensiveness doesn't work in your collaboration. You can understand that someone's people-pleasing because of their conditioning, but you can still require that they communicate honestly. Understanding doesn't require accepting. Understanding doesn't require tolerating dysfunction. The fourth thing is to remember that your understanding is incomplete. No matter how much you study human behavior, no matter how many patterns you recognize, you don't have the full picture of anyone. You're always operating with incomplete information. And that incompleteness is actually useful. It keeps you humble. It keeps you open to surprise. It keeps you from being so certain about what you know that you stop seeing what's actually in front of you. So here's the move. If you're someone who understands people deeply, who sees patterns others miss, who anticipates problems before they develop, you need to make a conscious choice. You need to decide whether you want to be right about people or whether you want to work with people, because most of the time, you can't do both. Being right means analyzing, means understanding, means seeing through. Working with people means trusting, means believing, means taking them at face value even when you know more. And here's the hard part. The people who are best at understanding others are often the worst at making that choice. Because once you see the patterns, you can't unsee them. Once you understand why someone's the way they are, you can't unknow it. so the choice becomes active. Every day, you have to choose to work with the person in front of you instead of the psychological profile in your head. And that choice, made repeatedly, is what creates real collaboration. Not despite your understanding, but alongside it, using your understanding to be more patient, more forgiving, more willing to give people room to grow, but not using your understanding to create distance. If this explained why you struggle to work with people despite understanding them deeply, subscribe. Next time, we're breaking down why your awareness of human nature is keeping you stuck, and how to use it as a tool instead of a prison.